power. Talk to us about Brown is the New White. Why that title? I know it made a lot of people nervous, but I want to get into this idea of the demographic revolution and what potential that holds for all of us, including those who might be called upon to relinquish some of the power that they have overconsumed as compared to their fellow citizens.
Right. So I wrote Brown. I wrote it in 2014. We published in 2016, and it was really in the context of where do we go from here into post-Obama. So I'm quite literally a child of the civil rights movement, actually having a bit of a moment here. As I think, having been born in 1964 and having had a landmark birthday this year, and then realizing I shared this birth year with Kamala Harris and Michelle Obama and all these other people, and Tim Walz for that matter. I'm like, oh, this is our year.
You're in good company.
Right. But I'm quite literally a child of civil rights movement. We grew up in Cleveland Heights, Ohio. They wouldn't sell our home to our parents in the suburbs of Cleveland because my parents were Black. My earliest memories were with I read all the biographies of Martin Luther King in the elementary school library. Went to see Martin Luther King. My first memory of seeing Martin Luther King when I was a child. And so that civil rights milieu was always very made a big impression on me. So when when Jesse Jackson ran for president in the 1980s, that was a very formative and educational experience for me. And I dedicated part of Brown is the New White to Jesse Jackson. And I said, in terms of how Jesse had demonstrated the power and potential of a movement for social justice that becomes an electoral force. And you could see there what he talked about, the old minorities coming together, comprising a new majority. And so I could see it, and it manifested and played itself out in the numbers, in the math in the course of his campaign, right? From 400 delegates and 3.5 million votes in 1984 to 1,200 delegates and 7 million votes in 1988. Lost to history. Jesse was the highest runner-up in the history of the country up to that point in 1988. Oh, wow. So when Obama ran, it was very clear to me that he was building on the work that had been done from the civil rights movement through the Rainbow Coalition work, and that this was a manifestation of the demographic changes. And having run all these different numbers, I saw and confirmed that had Obama run against Reagan back in the 80s, he would not have won. There were not enough people of color in the population. And so the Obama coalition was about 80% of people of color and about 40% of whites. That has become the majority of people, but it at that time was not the majority of people. So that frankly, were just not enough people of color in the population yet for that to work. Yeah. So but then towards around 2013, 2014, people were not getting that message. The people in the progressive movement, the Democratic Party, and they're like, well, Obama's a once in a lifetime figure. We have to, go back to trying to figure out how to win over moderate white voters and mute our politics and distance ourselves from social justice and racial justice work. So I was like, that's not the case at all. So that's why I wrote the book, is to try to quantify and document how and why Obama won and what were the implications for politics going forward. And that means embracing, leaning into this new American majority of people of color and of progressive whites. So that was the genesis of Brown is the New White, and that's why we put it into the mix.
So I love that things are full circle in so many ways, because the idea that demographically, numerically speaking, the very same coalition could not have carried the day just a few decades earlier. I think that is a very powerful reminder as to the importance of collaborative coalition building. And one of the challenges that a number of folks seem to wrestle with, particularly in this day and age, where we have a lot of, I call them the alphabet gangs, where they have sort of identified as subsets of minority groups, and they're very much gatekeeping who's Black and who's not Black and who could get reparations, who's not really qualified, and you can only get a quarter of a check because 3/4 not. There's this whole discourse around gatekeeping who has access to Blackness in particular. And then alongside of that, there is this recognition that if, as you said in that book, and I believe Brown is the New White, how the demographic revolution has created a new American majority, it sounds to me like what you are saying is that taking advantage of coalitions that span racial differences, coalitions that span the traditional barriers that keep us separated, that is actually a source of power for those of us who no longer want to live under what I like to call a white supremacist, ideologically bound America. And
Right.
if that's the case, we're sort of at a tension point, an inflection point, if you will. And I'm asking this particularly because I've seen a lot of this increase exponentially in terms of social media dialogue and discourse on a variety of platforms. Can you talk to us about the power of coalition across those racial lines, particularly when I'm hearing from a number of my listeners, there is some concern about wanting to embrace the causes of other people because Black Americans and people of African descent often feel like when we do that, our issues get shortchanged and short shrift. And how do we take advantage of the potential power that this demographic shift offers us so that we don't end up like a South Africa when it comes
Right.
to the demographics that
Right.
ruled apartheid? How do we do that while maintaining a sense of urgency about the issues about which we are concerned, even if they're not a source of concern for other people in the coalition?
Right. So I've been going through a lot of I'm doing this like home renovations and trying to embracing art more and trying to think more about art. And so one of
Mm.
the pieces of art that I've gotten connected to is there's a African American women's grouping in Alabama called G's Bend Collective. And they
Huh.
make quilts. And they go back to civil rights movement and they're actually like in museums now, their quilts and whatnot. And so I've got one of their quilts and I had put around the edges of it this Jesse Jackson quote, which he used in his convention speeches. He says, America's not like a blanket, one piece of unbroken cloth, the same color, the same texture, the same size.
Mhm.
America is more like a quilt, many patches, many pieces, many colors, bound by a common thread.
Wow.
And so he uses like in his 88 convention speech, he goes group by group and he says, you are right when you fight for your issues, Latinos and workers, but your patch isn't big enough. And so we have to be
Mm.
connected and together that actually comprises a majority. And so that's what I've really tried to lay out. And that actually just had this great line in his 84 convention speech. It says, when blacks vote in great numbers, progressive whites win. And then he says, it's the only way progressive whites win. And so
Wow.
this is the other issue, right? So I was, I've had the privilege of working for the past decade with Stacey Abrams from Georgia, right? So
Mm.
we were some of her first national supporters. I met Stacey in 2012 and worked with, supported her work over the past decade, introduced her to different people, tried to be helpful. And I believe, and I have other people, friends who are like active in the climate change or the environmental space, and they've been working like lobbying Congress, trying to make changes, working on their issue. But I actually believe that, and that hasn't been my focus. I've been focused more on voter mobilization of people of color. The work we did in Georgia, I believe, has done more to advance the climate agenda in this country and in this world
Oh.
because Stacey did the work to lay the foundation to transform the electorate in Georgia,
Mhm.
manifest this new American majority of people of color and progressive whites, and then in the process send to Congress the literal successor to Martin Luther King. Raphael Warnock preaches from the church where Martin Luther King preached, flipped the control of the entire United States Senate, United States government, so that it could pass far-reaching environmental legislation. So I
Mm.
said I'd like to talk about the interconnection of these issues. Is that none of us are powerful enough to simply advance our agenda without the rest of us.
Right.
But when we do work together and bring to the fore this multiracial new American majority, all of our agendas can move forward. And that is, in fact, what we have seen over the
Mm.
past decade and over the past few years.
This to me feels very much like what Reverend Dr. William Barber talks about when he's having the conversation about the fusion. And I'm sorry, not the fusion, but the moral majority. And he's really been, I think, very powerfully introducing this concept to a lot of people. And my study of history tells me that that is consistently been the winning ticket. I mean, we can start with Bacon's Rebellion, which arguably was not a win, but we saw one of the first efforts there of this this multiracial, I'm going to put that in today's terms, even though I don't know that they would necessarily qualify it that way back in that era. But even when we look at the story of Wilmington, North Carolina, coming out of the late
Mhm.
1890s and what they were
Mhm.
able to do there with poor white farmers, poor black farmers, poor indigenous farmers, and they literally called it the fusion party. And so to me,
Mhm.
if we're going to live in a country that is trying, or at least gives lip service to this idea that we should have this multiracial democracy, then it's going to be absolutely necessary for us to figure out how to walk and chew gum at the same time. And that makes, from what I understand from my audience, it makes them some very uncomfortable because, again, there's this history of Black people opening up the civil rights era and then other communities coming in and seemingly benefiting from it in ways that we could not even benefit from it. How do we do this work while maintaining an allegiance to working on our issues at the same time? Because if walking and chewing gum is real, and I believe it is, there has to be a way that we within the Pan-African community can maintain an eye on our specific ball and our interests of concerns while joining with other communities. Because frankly, as you said, if our patch ain't big enough, ain't nobody gonna be warm with this little bitty old patch. We need a much bigger quilt. What is the science behind coalition that does not also require sacrifice of community interests?
I think there's two parts to that, probably multiple parts. Two, I would mention. For one, is there's important to have a set of relationships and knowledge and mutual respect for the struggles and the histories and the particularities of each community. And
Mm,
so that's something that I feel I really benefited from, particularly when I was in college, is that friends who came out of the Latino community and understanding better that community's issues and the history of people working in the fields and how all that comes together. So having a set of relationships of people across these different sectors is an important element in terms of having the trust, the knowledge, the coordination is one aspect of it. And but the other part, though, is that ultimately it's what's the agenda that we are pushing, and that historically
ah,
African Americans have not pushed a narrow agenda just for African Americans. Rosa Parks did not say we want the buses to be accessible just to Black people. The point was
mm,
we wanted the buses accessible to everybody.
yeah,
And so that's been the struggle and the fight. It wasn't just about people, Jimmy Lee Jackson and others didn't just give their life for voting rights just for Black people. They
mm,
gave their lives for democracy so that everybody could vote. And so that I think is how what we have seen play itself out. So obviously African Americans were
ah,
very motivated, enthusiastic, and excited with the prospect of electing Barack Obama, the first Black president in this country. And we successfully do that. And then what did we do? We passed healthcare reform that benefited everybody. And
right.
so that I think is ultimately the glue, is that it's advancing a universal agenda that
Mm,
unites us. The other aspect of this, and this is this is really what I try to illustrate as sharply as I can in my second book, is that we are engaged quite literally in an existential battle in this country over the identity of the nation. And it
yeah.
is a battle with the Confederates and their heirs who have never ceased to fight for this notion that this
Mm,
is fundamentally a white country.
mm,
And so the battle is, the primary issue is, will this fundamentally be a white country or will this be a multiracial democracy? And that has been the struggle that's raged for whatever, 165 plus years.
yeah.
And so in that context, I think all of us who are not included in that Confederate vision have common cause and have reason to be supporting one another to be able to break that hold around the concept that this is fundamentally a white nation.
I love that you call them Confederates present tense. That to me was jarring in a way that I really appreciate because the Confederacy didn't end, and we still have the Confederates who are, as you said, their heirs. But I love using that in the present tense to identify what it is that we're dealing with right now. I want to shift just a little bit. Actually, before we do that, I just want for the audience to understand what Professor Phillips, Dr. Phillips, is talking about here. I have seen this in real time, and we talk a lot. When I'm not on these airwaves, sir, I run a racial justice law center in Brooklyn, New
Mm,
York, the Center for Law and Social Justice at Medgar Evers College. And we're the only racial justice law center in the entire city, in the entire state, that's charged with using the law to advocate on behalf of Black New Yorkers. And one of the things that we do every 10 years, we have a census justice advocacy component, but we do redistricting work as well. And we have what's called a Unity Map Coalition between our center, which speaks on behalf of New Yorkers of African descent, Latino Justice Pearl Def, which speaks and represents the interests of the Latino community, regardless of race, and the Asian American Legal Defense Fund. And we started this coalition, well, I should say our predecessors were all the next round of leaders in these institutions that are now almost 40 years old. But when our predecessors set up these coalitions for the purpose of redistricting, it was with the recognition explicitly that we are constantly put into battles where we're fighting against each other. The Black community fighting the Latinos, fighting the Asians, vice versa, and all the way around for this little piece of electoral pie. When if we were to work together in the Unity Map Coalition, data driven, so while you might feel like the Asian community should have XYZ numbers over here, the census data says otherwise. So we use a universally accepted form of data to let us know what equity would require. And while you might feel that the Black community has always dominated this community, unfortunately we don't anymore. So we're able to have sort of a level set approach to something that is very passionate it's passionate for lawyers. It's probably not, redistricting is probably not the most passionate thing for other people, but it's passionate for us. But able to take some of the vitriol out of the discourse because we're using this neutral set, this census data, these numbers, and we're able to say, as people of color, we need political representation. Based on our numbers, the Black community can have this many numbers of representatives, Latino and Asian, so on and so forth. And it's difficult. It is not easy. The meetings are endless and the negotiations are ongoing constantly. But by doing what you said, we have relationships. We are not just coming together for redistricting. We are building relationships in between. We're collaborating in between and able to end up with an electoral representative map that is equitable to all, and based on population, which is the driving determiner for that. So I just want to offer that example for people to see how these things can happen in real time. But if we could now turn to your most recent book, also another national bestseller, How We Win the Civil War, win present tense. That's something else that sticks out for me, securing a multiracial democracy and ending white supremacy for good. I want to talk about the nature of the current Civil War. But before we do, my first question in this regard is, with anti-Blackness being an element that is sort of rife throughout all the communities in our society, including the Black community in many ways, how does the multiracial democracy effort work if we are also within the multiracial community also dealing with anti-Blackness, the type of which has in the past served to allow non-Black people who are not white to be able to take advantage of opportunities that Black people fought for but still don't get to fully realize?
Well, I mean, I would say a couple of things about that. Well, even just to that last point and tying together on the redistricting pieces, I increasingly think that, let me just say this out loud too. I was going to make this connection point. So there's actually this woman as a professor at Duke, Anthony Clark, who's an African-American mathematician. And she's actually trying to organize Black mathematicians and advance a kind of a whole quantitative justice field.
Oh, wait,
And
what's
so
her name again? Say that one more time, sir. I mean, look this up, please. We need to find this woman. What was her name again?
it's Ranthony.
Ranthony.
Ranthony Clark
Okay.
is her name. And so,
Awesome.
and she's particularly looking at trying to do working with on redistricting issues as well. And so
Okay.
that's a part of this as well, to try to bring the Black mathematician community, frankly, to bear on these kind of public policy
Wow.
challenges like redistricting.
That would be huge.
So I want to offer that. I also feel I feel, and this needs to be more fleshed out, I feel, in terms of from a public policy agenda standpoint. But actually, I did a call with some U.S. Senate staffers. They're looking at like affirmative action and contracting and the things they look at. So the structure of a lot of the public policy framework, they talk about utilization and looking at the numbers around the utilization of this particular racial group. How does it correlate with the availability of that group within the population? And then you see, and the mindset is their underutilization of people of color, different groups of color. And that's very much how the framework flows. I am increasingly of the mind that we should be shifting this framework to less about underrepresentation of people of color and overrepresentation of whites.
Ooh, say more, please.
And so if that's a different proposition, because you start talking about like why don't enough people of color opportunities, it's like, well, they don't have the education or this and that or the opportunities. And it's very much, frankly, a deficit framework. There's something
Mm.
wrong and lacking in us and in our communities. One of my friends says that people of color are under resourced and over mentored, right? In terms of right?
Agreed.
So if you flip the question to why are whites overrepresented in all of
Wow.
these different positions and all these different areas beyond their numbers within the population, then that begins that leads to a different inquiry. And then you have to start interrogating the question around racial bias, implicit racial bias, non-implicit racial bias, and that how do we get to the situation where whites are getting more positions? And it's a very different proposition. And I think it provides greater opportunity, greater level for unity among people of color. And so
Yeah.
there's less of, well, my group has this bit and yours has that bit. And it's a situation of all of the money, the lion's share of it is certainly controlled by, if not held by, whites. And what is the basis for that? And that's a very different frame of reference. And it's a very different inquiry in terms of how to move that forward.